Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to Crime Zone. Though you may not have heard of the term pseudocide, you're almost certainly familiar with the concept. It's the act of convincing the world that you've died even though you're actually alive. In other words, faking your own death. While there are many reasons someone might want to fake their own death, from escaping an unhappy life, to fraudulently collecting life insurance, to even playing a macabre practical joke, it turns out that one of the most common reasons for doing so is to avoid going to jail. While these attempts are often unsuccessful, they are usually nonetheless pretty interesting. So we decided to devote this week's list to a few examples that stood out to us in particular. Before we get to our list, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest videos. With that out of the way, here are 5 people who faked their deaths to avoid prison. Though Julie Wheeler definitely faked her death to avoid going to prison, her stunt was probably as much about escaping bad publicity as it was about escaping the consequences of her actions. In February of 2020, the West Virginia native pled guilty to federal healthcare fraud charges for taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Veterans Administration under false pretenses. The scam involved submitting fraudulent applications to the VA Spina Bifida healthcare benefits program, claiming that her company, JRW Home Care Support Services, was providing services to a family member. The VA Spina Bifida program provides support to the children of veterans who are afflicted with a serious birth defect, who often experience a range of ailments from mobility issues to trouble controlling their bowel and bladder. Not only was Wheeler overbilling the VA for the services she was supposed to be providing, she greatly inflated the amount and quality of care she provided to her family member. Though her routine was supposed to include 8 hours a day of comprehensive care, multiple witnesses attested that this was not the case, and the victim was deprived of many of the services that were supposed to be included. Meanwhile, Wheeler collected more than $730 a day from the VA while perpetrating her fraud. Knowing that she was facing up to 10 years in prison and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines, Wheeler decided that she would try to escape the charges by faking her death. To pull off her plan, she enlisted the help of her husband and 17-year-old son. On the night of May 31st, 2020, she staged a fall from the main overlook at the New River Gorge National River. Her family told police that she had fallen while searching for an earring and helped to plant items to suggest that an accident had taken place. After police were alerted, an extensive search of the area began, involving state, federal, and local authorities, as well as numerous volunteers. Of course, no body was discovered during the search of the gorge or the surrounding area. Instead, West Virginia State Police would find Wheeler 2 days later, hiding in a closet in her own home. After being arrested for the hoax, Wheeler was promptly brought in for sentencing. She received 42 months in prison for the healthcare fraud and will be placed on an additional 3 years supervised release after completing her sentence. Additionally, she was ordered to pay restitution to the VA in the amount of almost $290,000. Wheeler and her husband are also expected to face charges for the death hoax itself, including conspiracy and giving false information to police. If convicted, Wheeler could have another 5 years added to her sentence.
Though Samuel Israel III never gained the same name recognition for his Ponzi scheme as fraudsters like Bernie Madoff and Scott Rothstein, his story is nonetheless bizarre and interesting. Israel was born into a prominent Jewish family in New Orleans in 1959. Despite never graduating from college, by his early 20s he was working as a trader for various firms on Wall Street. In 1995, Israel founded his own company in Stamford, Connecticut called the Bayou Hedge Fund Group. Almost immediately, Israel attempted to build up Bayou's reputation, exaggerating his resume and portfolio to attract investors. Specifically, he greatly overstated the role he had played while briefly employed at Omega Partners, where he had worked with famed hedge fund manager Leon Cooperman. Though Cooperman privately told some investors that Israel was lying about his reputation, others started handing over their money to Bayou, and the hedge fund eventually took in an estimated $450 million. Like with all Ponzi schemes, Bayou publicly presented an image of success to its investors. However, privately, Israel was appropriating funds for personal use while also sustaining heavy trading losses. Between 1996 and 2002, Israel lost an estimated $55 million of his investors' money. After a particularly bad year in 1998, he created a dummy accounting firm called Richmond Fairfield to fraudulently audit Bayou's financials and assure investors that everything was fine. At the same time Bayou was hemorrhaging money, Israel was living well beyond his means, lavishly decorating Bayou's office space with terrariums full of exotic snakes and renting a $32,000 a month property in Mount Kisco, New York from Donald Trump. Ironically, part of the reason Israel's scam worked for so long is that he didn't claim to be the best in the business and never offered some of the more unbelievable returns to his clients that feature prominently in many other famous Ponzi schemes. Still, by 2004, Israel could sense that the days of his fraud were numbered, and in July of that year he started draining his firm's bank accounts in an attempt to hide what was left. A year later, the hedge fund collapsed and Israel was indicted on fraud charges. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But on June 9, 2008, the day that Israel was scheduled to report to prison, the story took a bizarre turn. Police found Israel's GMC Envoy parked next to the Bear Mountain Bridge in Westchester County, just north of New York City. Written in the dust on the hood of the vehicle were the words, "Suicide is painless." Though the scene was obviously meant to imply that Israel had taken his own life, no body was found by police, and investigators weren't buying it. Their skepticism only grew when they realized that "Suicide is Painless" was the title of the theme song from the legendary TV series MASH. It was only a matter of time before the suspicions of police were confirmed, when Israel's girlfriend, Deborah Ryan, confessed under questioning that she had helped the fraudster fake his own death. The pair had parked an RV just off the interstate where Israel's car had been discovered on the day he went missing. After abandoning his vehicle, he made his way to the RV and fled from there. A manhunt for Israel quickly ensued, ending with his eventual surrender a month later. He had been hiding out at the Prospect Mountain Campground RV Park in Granville, Massachusetts. On July 2nd, Israel arrived at the Southwick police station on a motorized scooter to turn himself in. The entire stunt ended up costing him an extra 2 years on his sentence. In a fitting end to his story, Israel was eventually taken to the Federal Correction Complex in Butner, North Carolina, the same facility that houses Bernie Madoff.
Though the lives of state politicians don't normally make for the most exciting stories in the world, former New Jersey State Senator David Friedland managed to make sure that his time in office wouldn't soon be forgotten. Friedland was born into a political family in Jersey City in 1937. His father, Jacob, was a labor attorney who served in the State General Assembly from 1939 until 1952. Friedland eventually followed in his father's footsteps, first becoming a lawyer and then getting elected as a Democrat in the New Jersey General Assembly in 1965 at the age of 28. However, as Friedland began to rise through the political ranks, it started to become clear that he was involved in some shady dealings. In 1968, he was accused by Deputy Attorney General William Brennan III of being one of several legislators that were, quote, entirely too comfortable with members of organized crime. Though no charges were ever filed against him relating to this accusation, in 1971, Friedland's license to practice law was suspended for 6 months after he was found to have violated ethics. According to reports, he had conspired with a prosecutor to drop criminal charges against a loan shark with ties to the New Jersey mob. Nonetheless, Friedland continued on in politics, seemingly without issue, taking a 4-year break after his 5th term in the General Assembly, only to come back in 1977 as a state senator. However, in 1979, his luck would begin to change when he was indicted along with his father for taking a $360,000 kickback while arranging a multi-million-dollar loan from a local Teamsters pension fund to a convicted fraudster. A year later, he was convicted for taking the bribe, as well as income tax evasion and obstruction of justice, after he asked a witness to lie to a grand jury. Though Friedland resigned from the Senate, it looked as though he might be able to avoid jail time after he arranged a deal with the attorney's office in Newark in which he agreed to assist in gathering evidence against some of his former associates. However, while in the witness protection program, he attempted to defraud the same Teamsters pension fund that led to his conviction in 1980. With his sentencing looming and with no intention of following through on his promise to help investigators convict his associates, Friedland decided to try to take a different way out. On September 2, 1985, the United States Coast Guard got an emergency call from a boat near the northernmost island of the Bahamas. Friedland had apparently disappeared while scuba diving 12 miles off the coast. A friend told investigators that he had gone diving after ingesting a large amount of painkillers and had never resurfaced. After both an air and sea search near the site failed to turn up any sign of a body, authorities were skeptical that Friedland was actually dead, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. It turned out that Friedland had indeed staged the so-called scuba-side, and would spend the next 2 years on the run before eventually being caught by the US Marshal Service. During his time as a fugitive, he adopted the alias Richard Smith Harley, and was tracked in several countries before he was eventually found in the Maldives. Ironically, it was his success in the area that would eventually lead to his capture, as he started a chain of successful scuba diving shops and made few attempts to hide his activities. At one point, he was even pictured on a postcard for the Maldives, dressed in diving gear and feeding a live shark. When Friedland was returned to the United States, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his crimes. He would also plead guilty to racketeering charges in December of 1988, for which he would receive an additional 15-year sentence. Friedland ultimately served 8 years at the Federal Correction Complex in Coleman, Florida, after which he found a career in advertising.
The story of Alfred Rouse might just be one of history's most extreme examples of a man trying to get out of paying child support. After illegally marrying at least 3 women and fathering children with several more, Rouse decided that he only had one way to avoid prison and get a fresh start: murder. Rouse's troubles began when he enlisted in the British Army during the First World War. Though he married his fiancée just before shipping out, like many soldiers, Rouse also pursued other women while overseas. This ended with him fathering at least one child while in Paris, despite the fact that his military career lasted less than 3 months. Just 10 weeks after arriving in France, he sustained injuries from an artillery shell and was taken back to his home in England. While this was the end of Rouse's life as a soldier, it was only the beginning of his life as a bigamist, as he quickly got back to the business of having numerous affairs, several of which led to illegal marriages. Though Rouse's battlefield injuries initially prevented him from working, by 1920 he was healthy enough to take on jobs that required a degree of physical exertion. While working at a local tennis club, he impregnated a 14-year-old girl from Edinburgh, who he later abandoned at a home for unwed mothers. In the years that followed, these affairs became more and more common for Rouse, leading to the first child support order against him from a woman named Nellie Tucker in 1928. Shortly after this, Rouse found a job that enabled his lifestyle even further, when he found work as a commercial traveler for a company that sold braces and garters. The job required him to travel extensively across the country, allowing him ample freedom to engage in extramarital affairs. However, by 1930, Rouse knew he had a problem. Nellie Tucker was now pregnant with another one of his children and fully expected him to marry her. Another woman named Phyllis Jenkins was also expecting marriage. This was in addition to the women that he had already illegally married and the now numerous child support order cases he had against him all over the country. Even the woman from Paris had managed to track him down and make a claim against him. With no intention of paying any of these women, and knowing that the claims as well as his multiple illegal marriages could land him in jail, Rouse decided to do something desperate. After hearing about the unsolved murder of a Scottish barmaid, Rouse decided that the best way to get a fresh start would be to fake his own death. He took out a £1,000 life insurance policy to ensure the financial stability of his legitimate wife and son, and then started to set his plan in motion. Rouse's scheme first involved finding a person of the same approximate size and weight as him to stand in as his corpse. The unlucky man was a bar patron that Rouse had previously met, who had told him of his financial difficulties and confessed to him that nobody would care if he lived or died. Rouse told the man at the bar that he could get him work if he accompanied him on one of his upcoming road trips. The man accepted, and the pair set off on the 5th of November, also known as Guy Fawkes Day. Rouse had chosen this date specifically because of the second part of his plan: to set his car on fire with the man inside to make it look like he had died in an accidental fire. He figured that with the bonfires being a regular part of Guy Fawkes Day, no one would notice the car fire or would at least mistake it for part of the celebrations. When the two men arrived at their destination, Rouse carried out his murder as planned, first giving his companion a large amount of whiskey before knocking him out with a mallet. Once the man was unconscious, Rouse loosened the feeding pipe on his vehicle between the gas tank and the carburetor and ignited the whole thing with a match. Unfortunately for Rouse, his master plan unraveled almost immediately. He was spotted walking away from the crime scene by 2 men who noticed the fire while walking home and who quickly realized what was happening. The men called the police and an investigation into the suspicious car fire began. When Rouse later arrived at the home of one of his mistresses, he knew he was in trouble. The story of the suspicious car fire had been covered in detail in many national newspapers, and it seemed like only a matter of time before he would be identified. He had been dubbed the Blazing Car Murderer. Though he attempted to go on the run, he was quickly apprehended by police at a train station in London. Once arrested, Rouse attempted to tell investigators several different versions of the events leading up to the car fire, all of which maintained his innocence. However, police knew about his legal troubles, his suspiciously timed life insurance policy, and were able to ascertain that the fire in the car had been deliberately set. Eventually, after a 6-day trial, Rouse was sentenced to death for the murder of the unknown man. Even after his conviction, he refused to give police the name of his victim and ultimately took the secret to his grave. He was hanged on March 10, 1931, in Bedfordshire, England. To this day, the identity of the man who paid the ultimate price for Alfred Rouse's scheme remains a mystery.
The story of Audrey Marie Hilley is one of those rare kinds of crime stories that is truly unbelievable from beginning to end. Equal parts disturbing and tragic, it almost exudes the same energy as a thriller film, eliciting a sense of helpless discomfort in anyone hearing about the case as they learn about just how dangerous Audrey Hilley was to those around her. Warning signs of Audrey's criminal behavior began shortly after she and her husband Frank began having children. Despite the fact that both of them were employed and that Frank's job paid well, the family never seemed to be able to save any money. This was largely to do with Audrey's lavish spending habits, which put significant strain on their marriage. Unbeknownst to her husband, Audrey was actually spending even more than what the couple made in wages, as she would frequently have sex with her bosses in order to get extra cash. At the same time, Frank began to suffer from a mysterious chronic illness, as did the couple's son Michael. Doctors attributed both men's illnesses to some sort of stomach flu. However, Michael's symptoms disappeared seemingly overnight after he left home to join the seminary. In 1975, Frank discovered his wife's infidelity when he arrived home early one day to find her in bed with her boss. His mysterious illness began to get worse shortly after, and he eventually died in May of that year. After his death, Audrey collected a $30,000 life insurance payout on a policy that she had taken out on her husband in secret. However, instead of pointing the finger at Audrey, doctors believed that Frank had died from hepatitis. 3 years later, Audrey took out a second life insurance policy, this time on her daughter Carol. The policy would pay $25,000 in the event of accidental death. Within months of the policy taking effect, Carol started experiencing a mysterious illness similar to her father's and was taken to the emergency room on several occasions. Carol's health only continued to deteriorate as the months passed, especially after Audrey began giving her injections that she claimed would help with the nausea her daughter was experiencing. When doctors could find no evidence of any underlying disease, they again failed to point the finger at Audrey, instead theorizing that Carol's symptoms could be psychosomatic. She was sent to undergo psychiatric testing at the Caraway Methodist Hospital in Birmingham, Alabama. During this time, Audrey continued to give her daughter the mysterious injections and told her not to tell anyone. Things finally started to change when doctors began to suspect that heavy metal poisoning might be responsible for Carol's worsening condition. Her symptoms by this point included numbness in her extremities, nerve palsy, and a loss of deep tendon reflexes. Tests of her hair showed that this was indeed the case, and that Carol had been given increasingly large doses of arsenic over a period of several months. Around this time, Audrey was also arrested for issuing bad checks, some of which were made out to the life insurance company where she had taken out the policy on Carol. These discoveries ignited suspicion about the death of Audrey's husband, and when his body was exhumed and tested, lethal levels of arsenic were found in his body. In October of 1979, Audrey was indicted for the attempted murder of her daughter. However, for some reason, she was granted bail. Almost immediately, Audrey disappeared, leaving behind a note at a motel room she had been staying at, claiming that she had been kidnapped. She was listed as a fugitive. While on the run, an investigation into Audrey's potential victims continued. After rat poison containing arsenic was found at her home, she was indicted for the murder of her husband in absentia. It was also found that both her mother and her mother-in-law had significant but non-lethal amounts of arsenic in their systems when they died. After fleeing, Audrey first went to Florida, where she met a man named John Homan. She was going by the name Robbie Hannon. After living with Homan for more than a year, she married him, and the couple moved to New Hampshire. However, Audrey's most bizarre move came in 1982, when she told her new husband that she needed to go to Texas to attend to some family business. There, she took on yet another alias, Terry Martin. During her trip, she called John as Terry, claiming that she was the identical sister of his wife Robbie Hannon, and that Robbie had died while in Texas. She claimed that there was no need for John to come to the state though, as Robbie's body had already been donated to medical science. After talking to John on the phone extensively and dyeing her hair and losing some weight, Audrey returned to New Hampshire to meet John, posing as Terry. It was when John and Terry put an obituary in a local paper that Audrey's bizarre facade finally came crashing down. Police became suspicious when they could not verify any of the details of the obituary, including the place where Robbie's body had supposedly been donated, as well as the church that had eulogized her death. Eventually, the woman calling herself Terry Martin was arrested and admitted her true identity. Audrey was sent back to Alabama to stand trial for her husband's murder and for the attempted murder of her daughter. In 1983, she received a sentence of life for the murder of Frank and 20 years for the poisoning of Carol. Though this seems like a natural end to the story, there was one final bizarre chapter to the twisted life of Audrey Marie Hilley. While serving time at the medium security correctional facility where she was incarcerated, Audrey was granted a series of day passes to be with John Homan due to her behavior as a model inmate. She eventually used one of these passes as an opportunity to escape in 1987, though this one was decidedly less successful than her previous time on the run. She was found 4 days later, suffering from severe hypothermia after having apparently spent most of her time outside in near freezing temperatures and in almost constant rain. She would die from a heart attack while being transported to the hospital. That brings us to the end of our list. Do you know of any other people who fake their deaths to avoid going to prison? Tell us about them in the comments section below. As always, if you enjoyed our video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest videos. Thank you for watching.